Hello, welcome to Headlines and Prophecy. I'm Sebastian Lucido. Today we're going to look at the headlines in Europe and also look at prophetic events that sort of tie into a trend that we're seeing there. When we look at Europe, they're having a resurgence of COVID-19. The COVID virus, which was declining all through the summer, began to resurge there. In fact, I think they're up 700% over early September's numbers. They're at about a rolling average of 78,000 new cases a day. And so their economy is beginning to get hit again. Countries like France imposed a 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew. Ireland is closing bars, restaurants, and entertainment venues. The Netherlands went into a 4-week complete lockdown, very similar to what we had early on. Italy is starting to close regionally in some areas. And so we're beginning to see a resurgence and going back into a lockdown, which affects their economy drastically. And so the difference between the U.S. and EU is that prior to COVID, we had 3 of the best years we've ever had as a country economically. Our unemployment rates were single digits and very low. We had great growth, great wage growth. We had things were flourishing, money was being spent, interest rates were low, and then COVID hit. And the difference between us and Europe is they were less fortunate. They didn't have the boom that we had. They had a decent economy and they had some growth, but when it hit them, it hit them hard. And some of the reasons why they are being hit harder than we are is because they're a much more closed culture. They rely heavily on mass transit. There's a lot of interaction. There's a lot of multiple housing there. It's a little bit different than the U.S. And so they're getting hit hard. And so countries like, for instance, Spain, was running pretty good growth, and then they hit 20-25% unemployment, and they're going to go right back there. You can't handle that for a prolonged period of time. So how does this translate into biblical prophecy? So when you look at the Bible tells us a couple of things. Number one, it tells us in Daniel, I think chapter 7, it tells us that Antichrist will join a union of 10 nations. So 10 nations will be brought together in a union. The Antichrist nation will be the 11th to join. And then he will subdue 3 of those nations. It'll go down to 8, and then it'll move toward world domination. And so we're looking for a 10-nation union. I remember back, I think in the late 70s or early 80s, when the European Union went from 10 to 11, that everyone thought that was the time, but they're now at 27 nations. And so when you look at the Bible also in Daniel, chapter 9, verse 26 and 27, it really tells us that Antichrist comes from the old European Union. And this is how it's phrased. It says, "And Messiah will be cut off not for himself." This is verse 26 of Daniel chapter 9. "Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary." So that happened in 70 AD. About 40 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, Titus led a legion into Israel, into Jerusalem. They destroyed the city, they ransacked it, they destroyed the temple, and they dispersed Christians and Jews throughout the Roman Empire to be slaves. And they crucified them 2 to a cross. They actually ran out of wood. And Jerusalem laid barren really until 1948, when they became a nation. Israel still didn't have control of Jerusalem. They took control in 1967, and so they took control of the West Bank, and the temple is yet to be built. But here's the thing. So between verse 26, where the temple's destroyed, and verse 27, where it says Antichrist, it says the prince that is to come, Antichrist, will sign a covenant with many, really establishing the ability to go back to the sacrificial traditional system, and then he'll break it in the middle. So the temple's going to be rebuilt. He's going to come in, and he's going to allow the sacrifices in the temple and then stop them at the 3.5 year mark. But it's clear that the Bible in this particular area says that Antichrist will come out of Europe. So to come out of Europe, they'd have to go from 27 back down to 10, or there'd have to be a new Europe. And here's the problem. Here's the reason that this looks plausible at this point. There's so much social and economic diversity among the 27 nations. When you look at all of the 27 nations, you have at one hand, you have Germany, France, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain and Italy, Belgium, that have very sound banking systems, very good economic policy, very, very good social standards. And then, of the 27, you have several countries at the bottom, like, Hungary, which is a great country, but it's not a big economy. Slovenia and Romania. And so some of these countries are still growing and developing. And so you have this great mix. And here's the thing. They have a common currency unit. So, for instance, Greece had problems back in 2008, 9, and 10, where the EU had to put money in to save the bond market. They had tremendous debt, and because of it, they were tremendously vulnerable to default by the nation, and so they came in. And so there's all of these groups at the top pulling all of these groups at the bottom. And so with COVID now, everyone has their own problems. We've seen Britain exit, that's Brexit. British exited the EU. There's talk of other nations leaving or breaking away or setting up some sort of two-tiered system. But it can't continue as it is. When we factor in the other social economic elements that we see today, one of them is China. More sanctions on China means less business for the EU. More sanctions on Russia means less economic development for the EU. And so the EU is in a very, very compromised position, even with COVID here and with what's going on. Any economic tremor or continued economic tremor will cause a lot of defaults there and depression there. So let me just give you a little bit of a study about Antichrist. There's 4 different sort of scenarios that teachers or scholars believe about Antichrist. One is that he comes out of Europe, that he comes out of the European Union, any of those nations. When you look at Rome, it covered from England all the way over to Asia, all of the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And so a lot believe that he comes out of Europe. There's a lot of evidence to point to that. Others, there's a smaller group that believes he comes out of Turkey, because Rome had 2 capitals. It had a western capital, which was Rome. It also had an eastern capital, which is today Istanbul, which is in Turkey. Some believe that he comes out of Turkey because Turkey and Syria were very influential in managing Rome's assets in the Middle East. And so some think he comes out of Turkey. I don't, because there's a war. If you go back, I think 3 or 4 weeks and look at one of our headlines and prophecy programs, you'll see we talked about the Ezekiel 38 war, in which the name of that nation is Togarmah, which is Turkey, and they're destroyed in that war. So you have to believe that war happens in tribulation and not before. The third is a more contemporary point of view, which is the 7 nations in the G7, which, Japan, US, England, Germany, the 7 great or large economies of the world. Right now, Russia is a member. It's actually the G8, but they've sort of been blackballed. But some think that grows to 10. And then the 11th is Antichrist, which would be a global confederacy. Others, and this is something that I wrote about years ago because of my finance background, I could see that there'd be an economic collapse as a part of Antichrist coming to power. I mean, Hitler came to power because of financial issues within the country. Well, if you wanted to put the world back together again, the U.S., Canada, England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, Italy. Those are all very sound nations with very sound banking disciplines, very good central banks. Even though they're feeling pressure, they're making the right decisions. And so if the world were to fall apart economically, I could see those nations along with Australia and New Zealand and some other nations. I call it the Anglo group, but essentially it's the resurgence of Nazi Germany. It's a group of nations who were founded or settled by England and or had relationships with England. So I call it the Anglo group, because if you had to put the pieces back together, they would be the ones that would have the technology, the infrastructure, the intelligence to restructure the entire banking of the world, to bring it back together. And so, and again, what was Germany's message? That they were dominant because of race. And the scripture that points to that is in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 1. There's a beast with the 7 different antichrists that have lived. So, for instance, Egypt, Pharaoh was a type of antichrist. Caesar, Rome was a type of antichrist. There were 6 that have already lived. The last was Rome. And it says that one of the heads, the 7th, which is Antichrist, was wounded and its deadly wound healed, and it came back, and the world marveled after the beast. And so one of the thinking processes is, one of the thoughts are that Germany would or the German thinking would resurrect, because they had basically an Aryan race, and they felt that they dominated, and anything's possible. I believe that the old Roman Empire is a part of this. So a lot of things have to happen. Financial collapse, 10 nations coming together. I could see 10 of those nations coming together and building a really good alliance from the outside looking in, and then Antichrist would join that alliance. We also play into this one way or another. Either we get completely taken out of the picture, or we merge in and we're a part of this whole process. So, a lot of our elections and a lot of what's ahead of us is going to determine a lot of that. So we have to continue to pray and believe God, and just believe that this nation was founded to do something great and separate. Amen. And so with that, thank you for watching today. If you want any of our past blogs or teaching on end times or teachings, Bible studies, go to our website, www.watchersoftruth.com. That's watchersoftruth.com. And again, until next week, God bless you.